been a challenging time because we went through the pandemic and I haven't met her in person for a real long time. And
we just met in person 3 months ago after 4 years.
We've been in conversation with each other over the years.
Yes.
She took many classes with me, including one on site-specific art practices. So this project was born in that class, and we were looking at a number of artworks, primarily public sculptures, public works in the Kansas City area and the way they relate to specific sites, to architectural constructions, to outdoor areas, and she chose to work on the Steeple of Light, and we discovered that it has a very rich history. So, welcome staff, and I also want to say that this is the last MA thesis in our history in this department because we no longer have a graduate program for our history, so it's an important moment, right? I mean, I think you have more responsibility on your shoulders.
Oh dear. Can everybody see?
Yep, looks good.
All right, well, welcome today. Thank you, Dr. Albu. She's been the most wonderful mentor and advisor and friend throughout this process, so thank you for everything, and again to my committee for all the time. Thank you, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today about the Steeple of Light, a light sculpture which shines far up into the night sky and constitutes one of Kansas City's most interesting landmarks. 4 powerful xenon lamps. Okay, I think I'm gonna need to stand over here just to advance. 4 powerful xenon lamps beam from the exterior perforated dome installed on the top of the Community Christian Church and create soaring light lines that converge in the distance to render a breathtaking spire of light. I'm curious, have you all seen the Steeple of Light? Okay.
I have not yet.
Okay.
I need to,
we've got
though.
one. So the Steeple of Light was installed in 1994, but its development from concept to final implementation is a fascinating story that's unfolded over decades and entailed significant obstacles. The study I present today offers a historiography of the Steeple of Light, which was conceptualized in 1940 by Frank Lloyd Wright as a part of an architectural design for a new church, a church of the future. He said it was no mere church building, but a new order, dated 10 years ahead of its time, not known for his humility. But the steeple was not built until the 1990s, when sculptor Dale Eldred and his wife and collaborator Roberta Lord re-envisioned and finalized the steeple. So why is there a need for this research in the first place? Members of the church community and the Kansas City community enjoy and even take pride in the steeple's display. Many people, like me, remember when it became part of the skyline in the 1990s, but don't know its complex and interesting history. Experts on Frank Lloyd Wright acknowledge that the community church project is among his least studied designs. And the Steeple of Light, as a key part of Wright's overall design, it's almost always mentioned as a novelty, but it's rarely examined in relation to the overall design for the church. Second, Dale Eldred had an internationally acclaimed career as a sculptor, but other than one published monograph in 1979, which I brought today, very little scholarly information exists about him and his contributions to, among other things, light and space art. Discussed most rarely of all is the critical role that Roberta Lord played in the steeple's creation and implementation. A mechanical engineer by trade, it was Lord who identified the lights that were needed to accomplish the steeple's dramatic effect and installed them in 1994 after Eldred's tragic and untimely passing. Third, seeing the Steeple of Light is a phenomenal experience. These 4 long light beams heighten perceptual awareness and inspire reflection on space and time, raising questions about what lies beyond the earthly realm. The reasons why this happens deserves a more intensive scholarly study. So what have my guiding research questions been? This church was actually destroyed by fire in its original location at Linwood Boulevard and Forest Avenue here in Kansas City in 1939, but was an exceptionally vibrant and growing community. Sources say that in the 1920s, it was the largest congregation in the state of Missouri. Why did church leadership decide to relocate the Church of the Future to 46th and Main Street? Rebuild, of course, but why relocate? Why did Wright design a ring of 8 searchlights shining out in all directions in 1940 as a steeple for his Church of the Future? What motivated Eldred and Lord in the 1990s to use 4 lights and change the orientation to point straight up and converge in the distance? How does the Steeple of Light engage with the history, function, and discourse of this church? And what are the factors that make Eldred and Lord's light sculpture so phenomenologically unique? In order to answer these questions, I relied on the following resources and methodologies. I derived contextual evidence from biographical and historical information. The wonderful collections of the State Historical Society of Missouri and the Missouri Valley Special Collections had copious information about the church throughout its history. Architectural historian Joe Seary has written extensively about Wright's ecclesiastical designs, of which 10 were built, and devoted one lengthy chapter to the community church project in his volume on Wright's Beth Shalom Synagogue, which is in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. While it's an excellent summary, I tried to address some gaps in the research. The Spencer Library at the Nelson Alkins Museum of Art has an artist file on Dale Eldred, and I mentioned the one monograph, which does contain numerous interviews with Eldred and provides insight into his earlier career. Finally, my own live interviews with people associated with the church and who knew Eldred and Lord were indispensable. 90 of Wright's architectural drawings for the community church project are digitized at Columbia University's Avery Library, and I spent hours poring over these and trying to decipher Wright's notes in the margins as a means of generating maximal insight into his design for the church. In terms of methodologies, I used a semiotic approach to explore the ways in which historical narrative, church discourse, and shifting social contexts have influenced the interpretation and embodied experience of the steeple. I relied on human geographer Yi-Fu Tuan's philosophies regarding the concepts of space, place, and time to trace diversions of meanings between the plans of the key players who all contributed to the development of the Steeple of Light over time. Tuan says that places are not just facts to be explained, but realities that should be understood from the perspective of the people who have given them meaning. Last but not least, physical evidence, many trips to see the lights. My thesis examines multiple layers of meaning within the Steeple of Light. First is the architectural concept of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then is the light sculpture of Dale Eldred and Roberta Lord. I look at the differences and points of intersection between their vantage points to elucidate the affective role of the Steeple of Light in the church community and the broader Kansas City community context. The collaborative effort between Dale Eldred and Roberta Lord did much more than fulfill Wright's vision for the steeple. I argue that although the name stayed the same, through Eldred and Lord's artistic and technical expertise, the Steeple of Light substantially changed in both form and meaning. By changing the orientation of the lights from shining out in all directions, as Wright initially designed, to shining straight up and converging in the distance, Eldred and Lord introduced a different focality to the Steeple of Light, one with far greater spatial and temporal scale. So I'd like to guide you through a chronology of the Steeple of Light and present my research findings, making evident the steeple's expanding meaning in relation to Wright's architectural vision, Eldred and Lord's viewpoint on the steeple, and the steeple today, taking into account the discourse of the church throughout these different time periods. Okay, so just months after a fire burned the community church to the ground in its original location on Linwood and Forest, here's a picture of the original church, Reverend Dr. Burris Atkins Jenkins decided to move his large congregation to a new site 3 miles south at 46th and Main Street and hire one of the world's most famous architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, in April of 1940 to design him a church of the future. A quick word about Dr. Burris Jenkins. Learning about him alone was one of the most fun aspects of this project. Unaffiliated with any specific Protestant denomination since the late 1920s, Jenkins declared that his community church was not a Linwood Boulevard church, nor a neighborhood church. The community church is and must continue to be a metropolitan church, serving a citywide congregation. He instigated an open membership policy, which was radically unconventional at the time, meaning anyone was welcome to join his church regardless of religious affiliation, or lack thereof. I mention this because his progressive ideals had direct implications on Wright's design for the church, and because his open and inclusive service-oriented approach to his ministry can still very much be felt in the church's culture today. Wright's designs for the community church featured a modernistic, low-lying, hexagonal-shaped building with light projections beaming from its rooftop instead of a traditional church spire. While the new church opened its doors in January 1942, several elements of Wright's design were not built at the time, including, for example, this chapel, this 3-tiered parking extension, and the steeple of lights. Sources cite reasons such as budget constraints, concerns over possible wartime blackouts, and insufficient technology. So why the move and why searchlights in 1939 and 1940? First, the building committee that Burris Jenkins assembled shortly after the fire consumed the original building reads like a who's who of Kansas City at the time, and several people stood to gain financially from moving the largest congregation in Kansas City to the Country Club Plaza area. Even the person who owned the lot at 46 in Main is on the building committee list. I included, so anyway, and I wish I had time to go through it because it's really fascinating. And I also included this invitation to the Easter service, which you might notice is not at the church, but at Municipal Auditorium, which was also recently built at the time. And it's not because the church burned down, it's because estimates were like 10 to 12,000 people came to these Easter services. So it's really, really interesting. And though the neighborhood where the original church had been, Hyde Park, had been very popular and even essential to city commerce throughout the 1910s and 1920s, it had been redlined during this time for racial reasons. This meant that residents could not insure their houses or apply for mortgages the way that the residents and business owners in the non-redline parts of the city could. Redlining also tended to discourage public and private investment in those areas. Henry Russell Hitchcock wrote a very well-known book on Wright called In the Nature of Materials in 1942, just as the new church was opening its doors, where he observed the other great project of the immediate present, the Kansas City Community Church, now nearing completion, occupies an urban site which has quite broken its 19th century bounds and spread out all over the hills to the south, leaving its earlier shell behind to die of blight. Indeed, Kansas City bears the scars of redlining to this day, including the area at Linwood and Forest. Reverend Jenkins was an outspoken advocate of education as well, and he preached about it often. He was one of the first local advocates, for example, of teaching evolution in schools. He himself was highly educated and had been president of 2 universities before accepting the position of senior pastor at the church in Kansas City. He delivered the first commencement address for the University of Kansas City that had been newly organized in 1933, right here, now UMKC's campus, of course, and called it the University of the Future. Jenkins said, education lies at the base of things. Reform that, and you have reformed the state, society, the civilization, and the church. If religion is to become more effective, education must become more effective. If religion is to become bigger and stronger, then education must become bigger and stronger. With this in mind, his steeple of lights could certainly have signified enlightenment. Searchlights were not new in the 1930s and 40s. I wish I had more time to dwell on this aspect, but this slide should highlight some of the many images of searchlights that circulated at this time and the ways in which searchlight technology was related to the way that people conceptualized the future. You can see here they were often used in wartime maneuvers, and this was very much interwar and wartime. Nazi rallies at Nuremberg, the Cathedral of Lights, designed by Hitler's architect, Albert Speer. This is the closing ceremony at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. This was called the Dome of Lights and also designed by Albert Speer, interestingly. This is the 1939 and 1940 World's Fair in New York City, and you can see the searchlights. It was very focused on the future. The theme that year was building the world of tomorrow. And then here, of course, is 20th Century Fox's logo. Finally, there is a presence of distinctively religious symbolism in Wright's design for the church. Joe Seary, whom I believe has published the most information about the Community Church Project, focuses on the absence of religiously symbolic elements in Wright's design as aligning with Jenkins' desire to be an open and non-denominational church. And while I agree with this, I consider it to be an incomplete characterization that overlooks Jenkins' core belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ, which he described as of universal validity. This central adherence to Christianity did have implication in Wright's design. Here, for example, is a 5-foot cross that Wright specifically designed for the altar area, which was not built, and his plan for a chapel, which I mentioned, which was also not built, and I deciphered his notes in the margin and tried to sort of translate them, his writing. These are all very, very distinctively Christian symbols that were supposed to be incorporated in perforations in the ceiling here. Again, the chapel was not built. Finally, Wright's intention, interestingly, was not only for the lights of the steeple to shine out in all directions from the roof, but to shine down in the interior of the chancel. Siri mentions this, but he does not discuss how the light converges on the speaker. Oh, this happens with some regularity because of the guy's name. Anyway, it converges on the minister standing on the altar delivering the sermon. In fact, Burris Jenkins talked about the radiance of Jesus Christ, and in at least one of his books, and he called the New Testament a radiant book. This slide shows the hexagonal perforated dome that Wright designed, which houses the lights that create the steeple on the roof. The perforated dome condenses the hexagonal geometry of the whole plan for the building. And you can see its significant position right here. See this line going right up to the top. This is the altar right here. The steeple is directly over the altar of the church. Often calling the dome a lantern on his drawings, Wright described, whereas the building hugged the ground, it will aspire toward heaven, with reaching fingers of light rather than a solid Gothic steeple. According to Wright's concept of organic architecture, where all elements of a design work as one, with the outside coming in and the inside going out, this dome served as the gateway for evanescent light to shine down on the altar and emanate from it. Amazingly, the steeple remained unbuilt for 50 years. It nevertheless had become an idea full of meaning and identity embedded in the mind of this church community, almost as if it was actually there. But it was not until the fall of 1990 that Dale Eldred, world-renowned local sculptor and longtime chairman of the Kansas City Art Institute's sculpture department, was hired by the church under the leadership of Dr. Bob Hill, who was senior minister at the time, to fulfill Wright's vision for the Steeple of Light. Eldred and his wife and collaborator, Roberta Lord, who I've mentioned, began experimenting with the various kinds of searchlights available. Tragically, however, Dale Eldred passed away in a fall in his studio in 1993 before the steeple was completed. The design for the sculpture was finalized and installed 1 year later in 1994 by Lord. One source insists that Roberta Lord made the decision to focus the lights all together to form a steeple. It is thanks to her and to the perseverance and vision on behalf of this church community that the Steeple of Light shines today. And this is one of the original light cannons that they installed in 1994, which is on display in the church today. So what makes this light sculpture so phenomenologically unique? Several factors inspire a feeling of awe and transcendence in viewing it. Its astronomical dimension should be considered as one factor, because no matter where it is viewed, there isn't any other visual reference point for us at that height except the stars and maybe the occasional plane with flickering lights. While the building itself is understated, the steeple's monumental scale is highly visible in every direction, inspiring a sense of wonder as passersby come across it. Even half a mile away, it has no context with which to relate, no way to determine a definite endpoint. Unlike Wright's design, where the lights beamed out in all directions, now the lights were focused in one direction, up, and at a scale so great we can't know the end. I'm skipping one because I don't agree. Though he did not live to see it, if we have time, we'll come back to that. Though he did not live to see it, Eldred knew the reaction that the steeple would bring because he had completed a similar structure, a similar sculpture called Sky Column, which was on display for 2 hours in downtown Kansas City in 1985. 8 powerful gas-powered searchlights aimed at the sky coincidentally had been used in 1942 for wartime maneuvers, focused at the sky. A reporter quotes him, Eldred, in an article saying, "Ah, look." He knew the phenomenal experience of transcendence and wonder the lights would create and had experienced it himself. Lord spoke about how Eldred was drawn to the sky and why he often chose it as his medium and canvas, saying, he chose the sky because that's where he looked when he strove to think beyond the edge of his imagination. Their design for the steeple points there. On cloudy nights, sometimes it actually spotlights the sky, allowing the present and our presence to come into focus. Over the next 20-some years, the light fixtures that Lord installed dimmed and burned out. In order to help with the cost of replacing expensive fixtures, a new entity was created in Kansas City called Right on Main, a nonprofit unaffiliated with the church itself, but dedicated to preserving the Frank Lloyd Wright design building at 4601 Main Street. As it had in 1939, when the original building burned, the church would rely again on members of the Kansas City community to make its architectural goals a reality. Their first goal was to replace the light fixtures and get the steeple working again. These newly replaced light fixtures went live on Easter weekend of 2021. When you said you were in Puerto Rico,
Yes.
is that right? Which marked
That's
not
why I
only
haven't
an
seen that.
exciting moment for Kansas City and a symbolically joyful celebration in the Christian church, but a return to in-person services after the pandemic. In a very public way, the steeple of light became associated with a symbol of hope for the future after the darkness and isolation that marked a global pandemic. The lights can also be dedicated to shine for specific people and groups on any night of the week for a small donation. In this way, anyone can participate in the creation of this phenomenal light sculpture. This generous action of giving the lights to someone else is a poignant way that the community engages with the steeple today and vice versa. The message of dedication goes out to everyone on social media. So I'd like to close by asking you to think about how you feel when you look up at the sky. What do you think about? What do you experience physically and mentally? With all the looking down we do in our daily lives, I'd like to think that the steeple of light is a reminder to look up and become aware of your change in perspective. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see it, Professor Hartman, I want to let you know that the lights will be shining for you tonight, my esteemed committee, in appreciation and gratitude for all the time and effort that you've put toward my thesis during this very, very busy time of year. I really do thank you so much. I hope you'll be able to see them. And as the lights take your perception all the way up, reaffirming that we all share the same sky, consider it an invitation to reflect on the history and the future that surrounds us. Sorry. So that's the end of my presentation, but in the unlikely event that I'm under 20 minutes, I have bonus content that I would love to, it's only one page, which I know, okay, may come up? Okay,
Yes.
all right.
And please feel free to bring it into
Okay,
conversation.
okay,
as
sounds
well.
good. It'll
Very
be
excited to hear
interesting.
about it, and thank you for sharing your very thorough research with all of us. So the ritual of our department when it comes to MA thesis, and Ashley is familiar with it, just another program, is that usually after the presentation of the research findings, we take some time to discuss as a group, to ask additional questions, and after that, we need to ask everyone to step out just for 5 minutes or so for the committee to debate and then draw the final conclusion. So just let everyone know the rules of the game.
Thank you, yes. Any questions? This is a project that could consume the next 10 years. It's that interesting of a community and a piece of local history that even as recently as last week, I came across something interesting. So, but I'd love to take any questions. Yeah.
I guess I'll start with kind of an easier question, and one I'm just kind of curious about. What drew you to this project in the first place? Where did it start?
Well, as Christina mentioned, I took a site-specific art class with,
Okay.
it was on Zoom, but it was really, really fascinating. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and the readings were wonderful, and all of us had to choose one site-specific art, one local site-specific art, piece of art,
Oh, cool.
and I chose the Steeple of Light. And it's funny, of course I revisited my presentation from that class, and I almost had to chuckle because it was such the tip of the iceberg. You know,
admittedly, they just had to write like a wiki page
Okay,
on
gotcha,
an artwork from.
It's
So
just
it was
this-
not the main seminar
Right.
paper. So it
Yeah.
was very succinct text,
true.
fully accessible to a broad audience that could be ready to be placed on a website.
Gotcha.
Yes, and presented on Zoom. So, however, I count myself among those that were living in Kansas City in 1994. We were engaged to be married at that time, and I remember the lights going on. I literally remember driving down Ward Parkway and seeing them for the first time as I approached the plaza. So they made an impact on me then, and I have to say, I never ever get tired of seeing them. Paul and I have made, and my kids too, have made many intentional trips to see the light because of this project, to see the steeple because of this project, and it's a wow every time. So, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Yeah, so I'm interested, just like you are, in how the design has changed since Frank Lloyd Wright, and maybe even how depictions of religion or spirituality have changed too. And I wanted to ask you to clarify, because I don't remember, how many light beams did Frank Lloyd Wright design?
So his design called for 8 1,000 candle power lights beaming out in all directions. His overall geometry for the building was based on a 60-degree angle, and so the lights presumably were also going to be focused at a 60-degree angle. That organic architecture, everything was very precise. So regarding the decision to go down to 4 lights and focus them all up, I wish I could get a glimpse into the mind of Dale Eldred. I did bring some visual aids. I brought some of the books that Burris Jenkins wrote. He was a prolific author. He published 17 books. They're Church of the Future Dale. These are specifics about the lights that were installed in 1994 and the lights that were installed in 2021. And the only shred of actual evidence that I have of Dale Eldred's plans and Lord's plans is this. It's a contract addressed to Dr. Bob Hill, and it actually calls for 10 light fixtures. However, this was dated in November of 1990, so that was 4 years before the lights were actually installed. So obviously it changed quite a bit over time.
Well, in terms of the 8 number that Frank Lloyd Wright had in mind initially, ultimately this also relates to the octagonal apertures, right?
Yes.
Ceiling, so you have this kind of number reappearing probably at different parts of the church in terms of the architectural configuration. And
well, I don't know whether I came across too many of the number 8. But one interesting thing is there is evidence that, and I have a copy of the correspondence between Frank Lloyd Wright and the light and sound specialist here in Kansas City, O'Rear, and this individual cautioned Wright that the way that he designed it may not achieve the effects that he wanted, and he actually recommended focusing them together. And in fact, he even says in his letter that he thinks that 4 beams would be sufficient. And there's
what was the date of?
that was
approximately like
1941.
Okay.
Sometime between it was either 1940 or 1941. I'm surprised I can't cough up the exact date.
I'm thinking of the 8 motif just because most of the buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright are characterized by this holism, which goes along with this concept of organic architecture. So thinking of the octagonal apertures, I cannot help but think he wanted 8 because of that.
So that makes sense.
I don't know. This is just my intuition. Just because I've seen other buildings that include these geometrical patterns.
Sure.
And
he did not do anything by accident. So
Canton Knob in Pennsylvania has this kind of apertures, and they are also, I think they are octagonal. I'm not sure, like hexagonal or octagonal, but they repeat it throughout the building. You have this pattern reoccurring in different areas. This kind of search for like the indoor-outdoor connection, also had to do with this idea of holism, right? Ultimately, the building is part of the environment, and you brought this up in your thesis. What I'm wondering as a follow-up to Ashley's very good question is, what have you learned about this relationship between the projections upward and the projection inward, right? Would there have been a switch in terms of the areas to which they are oriented, or how would that have functioned in terms of the chapel with the downward projection of the lights?
Well, that
Were they
wasn't the
distinct
chapel.
lights, or
That was the actual chancel area.
chancel?
Yes, yes. The chapel, however, and this does get into my bonus content. The chapel was also supposed to have. Okay. I want to address real quickly though. The lights do not shine down into the interior, as that drawing showed.
But that was a concept.
That was the concept at the time. But because the Steeple of Light was not built at the time, they actually they covered the screen, and so light comes in from the outside. So you'll see, like if you go into the church, you can see natural light come in to that area. But the steeple's lights do not shine down.
No, that was very clear, but in terms of the concept, I wondered if he had any notes on that drawing, you know, like making a case for is this like a matter of reorienting the lights, or were they different, a different set of lights?
He does describe them. He describes them as light, I'm paraphrasing, light filtering through perforations I have put in the ceiling and patterned by them, or something like that. So he actually has some beautiful descriptions about it. Nothing that he writes exactly looks like what he drew, which is why this project was quite a melding of the text and the reporting on the building and looking at the actual drawings, some of which has his stamp and some don't. And then there are a couple that say void, and you know they've got a strike through them. So anyway, but if yes.
Yeah, so fascinating. I've learned a lot about Kansas City as a newcomer to the Midwest and to the city. So I really thoroughly enjoyed reading your thesis and the thorough research that you have done. So I'm interested in taking a bit the conversation into the social context. So you mentioned that the move from the original site to the current site was determined by finances and who's who on the committee, and perhaps keeping it located in the original site where it burned might not have given the financial sort of support that needed, right, to rebuild. So my question kind of has two directions here, and kind of following what Christina and Ashley mentioned about the switch in, and it would be interesting to know, I know you can go back in their minds, but this projection of 8 beams, right, and connecting that sort of web-like union of literal territory, right, versus going up. And I get the whole astrological and the transcendence and spiritualism that those beams indicate. And just as a side note, reminded me of the 9/11
Yes.
searchlights as well, immediately when and the time period is quite close. So going back to that switch, right? So my question to you, like there are a couple of layers to it, is do you think that there was a limitation in that concept of unionizing or unification of the different socioeconomic classes, even though there are 3 miles, right, difference from Hyde Park to the new location. So formally, right, or symbolically, if you take the beams, right, that are creating kind of like a octagon, right, or sort of a unified whole, right, that physically and symbolically encompasses a variety of communities, the 2 being, or the 4 being going straight up, right, where it's very centrally anchored in this location of near the Crown Plaza,
Mhm.
which was, again, you very nicely elucidated in your thesis, right? Was a boom, right? That's when the plaza was
Yes.
sort of conceptualized, was built.
Yes.
It's let's look like Spain, right? So it needed that sort of anchor, right? So you have this sort of church that increased its congregation tremendously due to Jenkins, right? And you have that presence. So have you seen or thought about that difference in limiting certain, is that community that was part of the congregation, you know,
Mhm.
even now, Hyde Park, who's the public, right? That is,
It's such a fascinating
it's a long question.
No, it's great, and I'll try to just sort of dive right in, because this religious institution was more than just a church at that time. They started the first preschool. My mom is a preschool teacher, for kids ages 2 to 5. They ran a free psychiatric clinic that was run by a physician and not a clergyman or person of the clergy. They had an employment clinic.
Okay.
They were very service oriented. When he said he wanted it to be a citywide congregation, he didn't just mean that everyone was welcome. He wanted to serve their needs as well. And actually, this is why I say that the interviews that I conducted with people were so critical to this, because I think Bob Hill put it best, that Jenkins saw that a lot of his congregation was moving south, not all, but a lot of it, and he wanted to be the center of it. And so if there was a location that was gonna be more central to the city, that's where he wanted to be. And there were as you point out, the plaza was new. The Nelson was relatively new. UMKC, the University of Kansas City, in 1933 was new. There was the public library. I mean, there was, which I'd really like to touch on if I could. Here on campus, that was a very new prospect, the Linda Hall Library. So there were a lot of things that were pulling him in that direction. As far as the beams of light shining out in all directions, I have to believe that it had something to do with that, with being the citywide congregation and pointing out ostensibly to everyone in the community. There are also sources that connect it to the Liberty Memorial and the height and scale of the Liberty Memorial and the ephemeral light that's on top that you can see still today. And the lights of the plaza. The plaza lighting started back in the 1930s, and it may very well have been a response to that as well. So
There's a depression too. There is that
absolutely
hope, right? And the hope that we see in the regionalists, right? In Thomas Horton Benton is creating in a different medium, right? But
Right.
it's all about nurturing that hope in a time of despair, right?
Definitely. And I talk in my thesis, of course, about Wright's Usonian architecture, which was, economical, and it may very well have played into his decision to use searchlights, because he may have thought that it was a much more economical and modernistic solution to a steeple.
So what you're saying is that sense of unification of different communities maintained, despite the fact that it was relocated, despite the fact that
I think it was him doubling down on that effort.
okay.
Yes. That's my,
Okay.
a lot of it is just, this could be, but following trails of evidence.
Yeah, sure.
Will you guys indulge me for 2 minutes? Okay,
Yes.
okay.
I'll indulge you, go ahead.
Well, no, let me take your question first.
So
and then
I'm
I'll
still
finish.
thinking about my original question too, and it has been answered, but even as I've heard other discussions, I'm thinking like, this number 4 has to be important somehow, and then I'm thinking like, all of this kind of came together under 4 people. So then it got me thinking about, like Wright, Eldred, Lord, and Jenkins, right?
Yes.
So this idea of like commemoration and like, monuments and things like that. And like,
Definitely.
even in the city, like we became the city of fountains, and that has like monuments and memorials and that kind of idea associated with it. So I'm wondering if there's a connection there.
I love that question so much because when in looking at the different meanings in the 1940s versus the meaning of the steeple when it was lit in 1994, I can't help but think that the people that witnessed its lighting in 1994 and those that were there for that ceremony, you know, as a sort of a monument to Dale Eldred after his tragic passing. I mean, you know, people were very close to him, and Frank Lloyd Wright wrote very specifically that the building was going to stand as a monument to Burris Jenkins, and so, yeah, there's a lot to that question. And again, that takes me back to Yi Fu Tuan's beautiful quote about, you know, the people that give things meaning. So. I say that Burris Jenkins, it was one of the most fun aspects of this project to get to know him. I would consider it the privilege of a lifetime, getting to know Dale Eldred, which I tried really hard to focus on interviews and things that he wrote, because I wanted to hear him speaking in his own voice. And I really feel as if I got to know him a little bit. And I've been felt a little bit of a kinship, because the reporter obviously, he must have been very enthused about the things that he did, because for the reporter to quote, look, in the newspaper, it was really a privilege to study him and to get to know him through his work and through his, so. Anyway, well, okay, I do have bonus content.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go for it. You guys can cut me off. And if anybody has to leave, that's okay too. Bobby may have a meeting. Okay, last week. This is the way this project has been. This is my bonus.
That's why it's so important,
Nice,
you know,
nice.
to
You were ready for
focus
this.
on that. There's a lot of context, right?
like
And
that.
you know, there's something to be said about the rootedness of this project
Yes.
in this particular context, and the benefits of having all the sources locally in terms of
Wow.
interviews, especially since
Yeah,
Dale
it's
Eldred is no
incredible.
longer alive. You talked
Absolutely.
to one of his students, so you've done your best to
Yeah,
gather
done my best.
this evidence.
I've done my
I don't know
best.
if you got to talk to Roberta Rohr.
Never
Yeah.
have been able to do
Right.
it. I really have wanted to kind of respect that boundary. And so,
It's also a project that I think it's so locally significant, but it's also, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright is arguably the Pablo Picasso of architecture, right? Certainly for the United States. So that's a big deal to be able to advance that research. So I think you've made a clear contribution.
oh, that's so
with what
nice
you're
of you to
doing.
say thank you so much. You know, a lot of people interpret him as having walked away from this project because so many elements were not built.
Right.
But I agree with Joe Siri, who posits that that he did not walk away. And as a matter of fact, and I think I need to add this to my paper, the building was supposed to be built in 3 phases. So what is built was the first phase.
So, yeah.
And Wright wrote about it in his autobiography, which was also published in 1942, where he makes comments that very much indicate that he still plans to see these things built.
Right.
So, so anyway, and there's a wonderful story where several years later he paid a visit to Kansas City, and came in and asked for the keys to the organ, right? And the some person came running to the church secretary and said, "I need the keys to the organ. There's some guy here." And she was like, "Well, what guy?" She said, he called himself Frank Lloyd Wright. And she was like, "Oh my gosh." And evidently he sat down and played the organ for an hour just to test the acoustics in the auditorium.
Wow.
In the sanctuary. And the comment that he says is wonderful. He says that he thought that considering, you know, the timing of the project with the building materials were difficult to secure, you know, in this pre-war moment. He said he thought the building turned out pretty well after all, or something like that.
That's great.
So anyway, okay. Well, on Wednesday last week, I walked out of the Miller Nichols Library, working on my project, and it was after dark, and the steeple's lights were on, and I noticed them immediately. And it made me think, you know, that building sits on an angle in that lot. Can you see it? So I inverted this drawing here, and so that this is north and south. Here's Main Street running north and south. And this building sits on an angle. And I don't know, this may be the end of the property, but it's not even quite precisely on that line. And so on a hunch, I pulled up Google Maps, and I had to crack up because even on Google Maps, you can see the hexagon shape of the building.
Oh, interesting.
And I put a dot where the steeple would be. And I ran a line straight through the center line of the church, just the way you can see this line here, which would have come out at the end of the chapel, and specifically would run right precisely through the baptismal font, which is also hexagon shaped. This was not built at the time. But I went ahead and ran the line directly through, and I kept going. So that straight line runs right in the direction of UMKC's campus. I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if that ended up right at Schofield Hall, which was the first building on campus and where Jenkins would have delivered his address in 1933. But it doesn't quite precisely go there. It precisely goes to the Linda Hall Library. You can see the dot goes precisely to the Linda Hall Library. And I thought, well, it's nothing then, because that building wasn't built until 1946. But then I looked a little deeper. The library was created by a bequest from Herbert Hall and his wife Linda, who left their estate and $6 million to establish a free public library for the use of people of Kansas City and the public generally, something that Burris Jenkins would surely have been thrilled about. Their wills stipulated that the library was to be located on the grounds of their estate, which was right there on that lot, and that it be named in honor of Linda. She passed away in 1938. And he in 1941. So it's possible and even likely that plans were underway for this library in 1940 when Wright designed the church. Remember that building committee that Burris Jenkins had assembled in 1939? Clarence Decker was on the building committee, and he was the first president of the University of Kansas City. And also E.F. Swinney, whom the gymnasium is named after, was also on the building committee. And look again at this, this slide where the lights were to shine over the chancel, of course. They were also supposed to shine above the chapel. And rather than pointing necessarily out in all directions, it looks a lot like they're pointing toward the Linda Hall Library. But the line runs through Winstead's too, so. That's my bonus content. I couldn't believe it when I pulled up Google Maps and the church is it's hexagon shaped. So,
wow.
Anyway, thanks everybody. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So.